I should point out that I'm a relative newcomer to Bathurst. I've only been here 19 years. But I do like digging into history. And I've now got 9 little bushwalking guides that I've produced, and more than half a dozen local history books, Blue Mountains, Lithgow, and now a Bathurst title that I've been able to pull together. Right. In 1913, the Bathurst Baptist Church produced a small history booklet to celebrate its Jubilee. 50 years later, for the centenary, in 1963, a slightly bigger booklet, still a booklet, was published. And when the church moved to its Eglinton Road location, Jeff Benson updated the history and took it through to 1988, but it wasn't published. As the church's 150th anniversary was approaching, just over 10 years ago, Elaine Fox spent countless hours gathering and copying material from old church records, but ill health prevented her from completing the task of producing an up-to-date church history. As the 160th anniversary, which was held in March this year, as it approached, Sue Ann, our church administrator, started drawing attention to it and putting things in our weekly e-news newsletter. And I thought, I think I could help to pull together that history so that we've got the book for it. And so I volunteered and have built on what has gone before and what both Jeff and Elaine had put together. And I've done further research as well. So the end result has been Scattering the Good Seed. I've got 4 copies here. There are just 6 copies left out of the 100 that we had produced. It's Scattering the Good Seed, 160 years of Baptists in Bathurst. 148 pages, A4 size, lots of photos, copies of documents, snippets of history from here and there. And they're just $25. And as I think I mentioned, I can take cash or card. I've also got some other books there, so feel free to come and have a look.
Make that 3 copies.
So let me share with you a few snippets from the church history. Back in January 1862, 3 Baptist preachers travelled, probably by coach, from Sydney to Bathurst. They held services in the courthouse, not the current one, but its predecessor. Then they moved to the Presbyterian schoolroom. The leader of the trio was Reverend James Voller. He was the pastor of the Bathurst Street Baptist Church in Sydney. Years later, their building had to be demolished, I think it was. The government had plans for that area, and they moved to George Street and became Central Baptist Church. Voller and his family arrived in Australia from England in 1853 after being shipwrecked on Amsterdam Island. Have you heard of Amsterdam Island in the southern Indian Ocean? I haven't either. It's 2 little dots down there in that ocean, and they seem to have a magnetic attraction for ships. Miraculously, they and the majority of the passengers and crew were rescued within a week. Another member of the trio of preachers that came to Bathurst was Reverend Robert Wing, a recent arrival from England. He was in poor health and unfortunately died within the year. The third was James Thornton, who had come across to Sydney from New Zealand. He was an interesting character. I won't tell you much about him though. The meeting stirred up a lot of interest, and James Thornton stayed in Bathurst to establish a church. In July the same year, there were plans to build a church building in George Street on land donated by local MP Henry Rotten. But by September, when tenders were called, the site had changed to Keppel Street. On 27th of October 1862, the foundation stone was to be laid by Henry Rotten. However, he was delayed, and so James Boller, who had come across from Sydney again, he laid the foundation stone. The plan was to build a 30-foot by 20-foot schoolhouse towards the back of the land with a baptismal pool in front of it. This was eventually to be inside the church building to be erected later at the front of that schoolroom. We Baptists believe in baptism by immersion, so we need a decent sized pool so that we can dunk you right under the water, you know. Apparently the schoolroom was completed by March 1863, and the church as an entity was formed then on the 21st of March. James Thornton became the first pastor, and the first members on the roll were Mr. and Mrs. H.B. Page. The Bathurst Baptist Church was the first Baptist church west of Parramatta. Thornton stayed for a short time, a couple of years, July 1864. The next pastor was Reverend William Field, but he was in poor health, and he left before February 1866, only to die in Brisbane a few months later. Next was Reverend Josiah Hinton, who stayed for 3 years. Bathurst was a centre from which the pastors roamed around on horseback and established outstations at places like Spring Hill, Kings Plains, Eglinton, Glanmire, Wentworth, Lucknow, Kellershiel, and several other places. After Bathurst, Hinton moved to Spring Hill and later established the Orange Baptist Church. The church building at 100 Keppel Street was built in 1870 during David Fenwick's time as pastor. This photo shows it clearly. I don't think these things work on a screen, no. But you can see the building there with the 4 windows, and here I've zoomed in on it. You can see the little schoolhouse behind it there. And can you see the goat in the neighbour's yard? Just up here, by the fence. I'm sure it's a goat.
I think it would.
Tremain's Mill can be seen at the lower left end of Keppel Street. The railway hadn't been built, but I think its alignment is along there. It may have been cleared by that stage. The photo's early 1870s.
Sorry?
It must just be the angle of the camera, but the church seems much closer to Bentinck Street than it really was. Some names associated with the church at that time were Sawyer, Page, Dumbleton, Cole, Petchy, Simmons, Godfrey, Warboys, Shakespeare, Hubbard, Goodman. Both Reverend Hinton and Reverend Fenwick went on to become presidents of the Baptist Union of New South Wales. Fenwick later returned to his Presbyterian roots and eventually was the moderator of the New South Wales Presbyterian Church in the early 1900s.
Excuse me, can I just add that I remember this building? That gives my age away a little bit. But I went in there with my grandmother.
Right.
And I was only a child, but I do remember it.
When I heard your name earlier, I thought, you better check out the index.
Yes, I want to trace
Choir
my
master.
great-grand... Yes,
Was it
my
your-
great-grandfather, John Love.
Great, Right.
I'd love to know more about it. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no, that's great. Reverend Philip Lane became the pastor in 1871. The church prospered with large congregations in the morning, and in the evening extra seats had to be brought in and placed in the aisles. Unfortunately, while he was still pastor, Reverend Lane died in February 1875. The next pastor was A.W. Grant, who continued outstation work at Kellershiel, which was out near Eglinton, and Mitchell's Creek, later known as West Mitchell. And then in June 1882, Reverend Ebenezer Price came as pastor, and I think he stayed about 11 years. During his time, the manse was built alongside the church at 100 Keppel Street. John Godfrey donated the land, and Joseph Godfrey loaned the money for building the manse, free of interest. Sometime in the 1880s, the portico at the front of the church was added, and Reverend Price was here for 11 years. He was known for preaching in the market square and his encouragement of the Western District Chinese mission work in the Chinese quarter. I don't know whether that came up for mention with the market gardens in the last talk, but there was a Western District Chinese mission. They had a Chinese missionary here in Bathurst. Apparently the blocks between Stewart and George Streets and Durham and Howick Streets were the Chinese quarter. Ebenezer Price left in November 1892, and for a while there was no pastor till well into 1893. The trustees of the manse, a separate arrangement to those of the church, had a loan to pay. They were a bit worried about being able to do that, so they put the manse on the rental market. Earlier church histories had shown that at one time it was rented to a doctor. Well, I got to work on Trove and found there'd been some interesting tenants. In 1913, it was a private boarding establishment run by Mrs. O'Connor. In 1919, advertisements announced that Dr. C.W. Thompson has commenced practice at 100 Keppel Street. He was, in fact, Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Clive Thompson, DSO. Possibly the second tenant, going back to 1892, was Mr. A. Ewerdine, dentist. He arrived in Bathurst in May 1892, and initially people could see him at Mrs. Barton's in Keppel Street. I'm just wondering whether that was a boarding house. And later he moved nearby to Keppel Street near Skating Rink. Then in May 1893 he announced he had moved to the Baptist Parsonage opposite Masonic Hall. Some of his earlier advertisements advertised the fact that he used cocaine or ether. I'm not sure whether the cocaine was used when he was in the manse. I mean for knocking you out so that you didn't get hurt. He moved out in about May 1894. On Trove I found that prior to 1892 in Victoria there was a dentist called Albert Ewerdine Burbank. He was accused of assaulting a woman, but apparently she had just tripped over his walking stick. But due to that he lost face in the community, was declared insolvent and sort of disappeared. And soon after that up popped a dentist called Albert Ewerdine in Bathurst. After leaving Bathurst, Albert Ewerdine vanished, but up popped Albert Burbank. First in Wagga and then in the Hunter and New England districts and Sydney too. And I've been digging a bit more in Trove, and one day I'll send a story to Alan and see if he wants to publish it about this interesting dentist. The side tracks which you get there. Back in March 1864, James Thornton had conducted a wedding at Spring Hill, where Thomas Warboys married Rebecca Seaton. Then on their silver wedding anniversary, their eldest son James was married to Rebecca Edgington. This Rebecca's mother was also called Rebecca. 3 Rebeccas? The family get-togethers must have been an interesting occasion. And James and Rebecca's wedding was, of course, conducted by a Bathurst Baptist Church pastor, Reverend Ebenezer Price. And then in July 1893, James Warboys was appointed as pastor in Bathurst. James was described as an outstanding man physically and a bold preacher, and he could plough. He'd grown up on a farm where he and his brothers were expected to work hard and well. Before coming to Bathurst, James was pastor at Pinecliff near Malon. And one day as he was riding along, he saw a farmer making a real mess of ploughing a paddock. He stopped and said, "Why don't you do your work better?" Imagine the farmer, "Well, you get down and show me how." So Warboys was soon behind the plough, turning a new furrow and resetting the land. The farmer said, "It's not the first time you've been behind the plough. Where do you preach?" "I'll be there. A man who can plough so well must be able to preach well." Pastor Warboys stayed at the Bathurst Church until October 1900. For a while he had an assistant, his cousin Arthur Waldock. Arthur married Charlotte Godfrey. The 1890s saw 4 building projects: renovation of the Keppel Street Church and the construction of churches at Eglinton, Perthville and Raglan. Other outstations operated from time to time, and there's a few names up the top there, even out at Oberon for a short time. And back, I think it was in the 1880s, in Ebenezer Price's time, Yarras. By the way, Pastor and Mrs. Warboys never got to live in the manse. The Perthville Church was actually built as a Christian Endeavour Hall with Baptist trustees, and it was opened with great fanfare in January 1898. They even had a decorated train from Bathurst. I wonder if anybody took some photos of it. And that church building still exists as a private house in Perthville. I don't know what eventually happened to the Raglan Church, the Eglinton Church. I think I'll mention it going a bit later. It was sold, and apparently the new owner of it was going to use it for some sort of gambling setup. And some of the church members were praying against that, and apparently it fell apart when he tried to move it. After Warboys came Pastor Charles Palmer, but he seems to have got on the wrong side of brothers Stocks and Carr. I hope there's nobody related to them here. And he had to resign. I don't know what the issue was. Palmer recovered from his forced exit from Bathurst, and he went on to be the president of the Baptist Union of Tasmania. The next pastor was Reverend David Steed, and he's pictured here with his deacons. And interestingly, he'd been a Seventh-day Adventist minister before he came to Bathurst. Another pastor was Adolphus Henry Tolhurst. He didn't stay long, and when he left here, he joined the Presbyterians. And later, during World War I, he served as a chaplain in Egypt, Gallipoli and France. Then in March 1910, Reverend Ernest Rogers came. Actually, he'd been born at Safala, and he trained for the Anglican ministry at Moore College before becoming a Baptist. I'm just amazed at the many pastors who switched denominations. A highlight of the year in many churches was the Harvest Festival, and I'm sure some of you remember Harvest Festivals and the obligatory display of nature's bounty. Albert Gregory, the photographer, took photos of the display in 1911 and of the church building. And I thank the Bathurst District Historical Society for sharing these images. I wonder if somebody could get me a glass of water. Thank you. The month after the Harvest Festival, Amy Davies, the teacher of the Young Ladies Bible Study class, organised for a photo to be taken of her class. And she wrote a poem which mentioned every girl in the class. Some of you may know Margaret Bauer. Her mother Valerie is in the front row. Thanks very much. And Valerie's verse in the poem was, "Val, warm-hearted, eager one, keep a firm faith in God's dear Son. Through trials, failures, still be true. God has a work for you to do." Matthew 16:18. Excuse me. And Margaret is still keeps in touch with the daughter of one of the other girls in that photo. I don't know who the people are in this buggy. It's the Baptist Archives in Sydney suggest that it's a pastor and his wife, and it's on Rankins Bridge at Eglinton. And of course, the only way to get around back there 120 years ago was by horse, either on horseback or in a buggy or something. And that's why the need for outstations at places like Eglinton and Raglan and Perthville. Reverend Rogers left in 1914 and his furniture was sold by auction, giving us an insight into his home. Does anybody know what a Duchess table is? Some homework. So there was a Duchess table with a mirror back, a brass mounted bedstead, Duchess chest, a nearly new main stove, and even the fowls were getting sold. The next pastor was Reverend Lawrence Jaggers, whose father had been born in Bathurst around 1839 and had been christened in Holy Trinity Church at Kelso. Next came Reverend James Hunter, and he lived at 98 George Street. The manse was still being rented out. But in May 1923, he told the church he had to move out of his rented cottage as it was going to be sold. "I'd like to move into the manse, please." Well, there was a bit of humming and hawing, but eventually the trustees agreed. And so after, 23, 28, over 30 years of the manse being rented out, finally it reverted back to being used for the pastor. January 1926, electric light arrived in the church. Must have been a grand occasion, you know, when you could actually see what you were reading and things like that. Malcolm McCullough came as pastor in 1937. During World War II, he served both in Australia and overseas as an army chaplain, and so he was alternating between times here at the church and times in the army. Some of you undoubtedly will remember Sunday school picnics. And here we've got a few of the children at the 1940 picnic. I wonder if it was red cordial in those cups. I seem to remember red cordial. 4-year-old Margaret Brooks, now Margaret Bauer, she's over at the far right. Winnie Philpott at the left. Pastor McCullough's son Philip wearing the hat, and next to him with the plait or ringlets with a ribbon on her hair there is Olive King, now Olive Edmonston, and both she married a Baptist pastor. Both Olive and her sister Helen have been in touch with me recently to buy copies of the church history book. So it's good when people from long ago find out about it and get connected with it. Now, a little snippet I came across was that in 1938, in June, it was the 400th anniversary of the placing of the English Bible in parish churches in England. And in the service at the Bathurst Baptist Church, Pastor McCullough read from somebody's family Bible, owned by one of the church members. The Bible was printed by Robert Barker in London in 1602. It contained the Book of Common Prayer, Concordance, Book of Psalms, and it had a family register in it, which the first entry was 9th of July 1617. A couple of little newspaper items about it, but they don't tell us who owned the Bible. Is it in the Historical Society collection, maybe? It'd be interesting, wouldn't it? World War II brought changes to the church. Young men went off to serve the nation. This photo of 4 young men from the church was taken in Malaya. Only one of them returned. Hamilton Oswald Staines, on the left, killed in action. Ron Harper died while prisoner of war. John Glasby, the only one to come home. Ken Adlin died while prisoner of war. Others from the church also lost their lives. Honour rolls were placed in the church after both world wars, but nobody seems to know what happened to them. Are they in the Historical Society collection? There's some thought about some things were stored underneath the platform in Stewart Street, and whether they got left there or somebody threw them out, I don't know.
They're all Bathurst people, are they?
Yes.
They're all Bathurst people?
Yes.
Yes. Well, I knew Hamilton Staines' son.
Okay.
Mm.
Right.
Mm.
Connections. And I'm sure you all know that Bathurst was home to a large army camp during the war. Many of the soldiers found their way to the services at Bathurst Baptist Church and other churches. And for some it changed their lives, not only spiritually, but some of them found a wife. Corporal Joe Penrose, the name down towards the bottom, he found a wife in Bathurst girl Olive Glasby, and they later served as missionaries in Sudan and in Baptist pastoral work, including some time in their retirement as an interim pastor at Lawson, when myself and my family, we attended there. the name of Harold Holt up near the top. From what I've searched on military records, doesn't appear to have been the man who later became our ill-fated Prime Minister. That page is from a 1943 visitors book, and I think there's 3 or 4 pages with all these names. An interesting historical resource.
Yeah.
1945, Alan Tester began a 4-year ministry. This photo of the church building was taken in 1948. I found this on the State Library online, searching. Note the rose garden. I reckon they're roses in the centre of Keppel Street. What a pity they weren't still there. Keith Evans arrived in 1950. When the church had been built 70 years before, cedar pews had been installed. And Evans was a cabinet maker by trade, and he set about a church renovation program. The pews were replaced with theatre seats, which I believe came from Sydney. They might have been softer, but it's a shame the cedar wasn't. Keith Evans used several of the pews to make a set of communion table and chairs. We still have the chairs. They're just inside the front entrance of the church at the moment. They're very small. And the communion table was incorporated into a new one when the church moved to Eglinton Road many years later. And most of the cedar pews appear to have been sold. The Eglinton Church was still in use in the 1950s. The Sunday school group here has Keith Evans standing behind the girls. Services at Eglinton ceased about 1955 and the Sunday school in 1958. And in 1964 the building was sold for £65. Pastors in years around that time included Reverend Dalton Armstrong, whose grandson John had been our pastor up until last year for 9 years. John Wesley McBride, a former rugby union star, and Reverend John Giles. In McBride's time, the church bought a new manse at 208 Keppel Street. During the 1960s, the church and Bathurst grew with young couples and families. In addition to the land on which the Eglinton Church stood, a large area of land was bequeathed to the Baptist Church by Miss Fanny Locke, who died in 1938. This comprised nearly all the land fronting Alexander Street, from Logan Street to the school, excepting the Union Church and Hall. In 1968-69, after years of surveys, document searches, legal issues with the title, finally the land was subdivided and sold in, I think, 14 of the lots were from that. I've called it the Baptist Subdivision Estate. One of our current deacons actually lives on some of that land. And the funds from these sales must have helped in the next stage of the church's development. By the 1960s, the almost century-old church building had significant structural problems, and the manse also had building issues. John Armstrong told me that his dad used to say if there was a hole in the wall in the manse, he could put his hand through it. When they lived there in the 50s. In 1964, several blocks of land were bought in Stewart Street with the plan to relocate the church there. In 1970, it was decided to erect a new building complex there, sell the existing manse at 208 Keppel Street, and buy the house on the corner of Stewart and Piper Streets, which adjoined the church lane. In early 1972, Pastor Michael Robinson was inducted to the Bathurst Church. Mike and Bev had 3 children. At his previous church, Pastor Mike had been involved in the building program, so that was handy, calling him when you have a building needing to be done. But before that could happen, he found himself helping church treasurer Don Bauer to demolish an old cottage on the Stewart Street land. In 1972, the church properties in Keppel Street were sold, with the church being allowed to continue using the buildings for another 2 years. Demolition of the buildings took place in 1974, and a new building was erected for Coleman's. Today it is Veritas House. When I look at those photos, I wonder, is that the same pole still there? It's got the same cross arms. Two builders associated with the church took on the task of building the new complex. I found it strange that church members don't seem to have taken photographs of the progress. Jeff Benson explained it. We were paying for it to be built. In July 1974, the new building in Stewart Street was officially opened by Egerton Long, the president of the Baptist Union. Attendance boomed, and soon there was not enough room in the new building. The Robinsons moved to Victoria in 1976, and the following year saw Reverend Bob Smith take on the pastoring of the church. Thanks for coming along tonight, Bob.
Thank you. I had dark hair then.
I think you're there somewhere, aren't you?
Right in the
you're
middle.
bending down here.
Yeah, right in the middle.
The city of Bathurst was growing in the 1970s, and so was the Baptist Church. Extra seating was needed, a building extension was needed, and the pastor moved into rented housing so the manse could be used for church activities. As a few years went by, Stewart Street was getting busier. Parking was both a problem and a safety issue. The church started thinking about a way ahead for the future. Eventually, the church in Stewart Street was sold to the Salvation Army in 1987. This photo is from 2013. Since then, the Salvation Army sold the building in 2020, and now it's been converted into 6 office suites. In 1985, the church bought a 5-acre site at the corner of Ophir and Eglinton Roads. It was a grassy paddock in the midst of a farming area. A few notes on the site plan must relate to the growth centre era. Down there it says future primary high school site, and I think over to the right at the bottom, Lanark Commercial and Community Centre. Neither of those eventuated, but today the church is surrounded by houses. In October 1986, church families gathered on the grassy site in a prayer circle and dedicated the land to the Lord's service. The church decided to construct the new building as an owner-builder, with the project supervised by Wal Carter. The Probably everybody in the church family participated in the project one way or another. Working bees were a common event. And meanwhile, services were held in Kelso High School's gymnasium and theaterette. More people were attending, and a change was made to the building plan to incorporate what was to have been an adults' lounge into the main chapel area to make it bigger. Oh, and this time, lots of photos were taken of the building activity. Did any of you go to Jeff Benson when he was a dentist here? Yes, yes, yes.
Mm.
Right, well, you can be glad that he took on the role of photographer. And he took many patients. If you were one of his, many photos he took. If you were one of his patients, just be glad he didn't turn up with cement all through his hands on Monday morning. This photo shows the building complex taking shape, and you can see the corner of Ophir and Eglinton roads, and just a few, pardon me, just a few nearby farmhouses. The new church was officially opened on 5th of November 1988. There's a chapel, 3 offices, 5 meeting rooms, a kitchen, a hall, and a caretaker's flat, and heaps of on-site car parking. Since then, Ophir Road has been closed, and the grass paddocks have become suburbia. Here's a photo from about 1990. Bob Smith moved on to Carlingford Church that year. In 1991, Mike and Beth Robinson returned to the Bathurst Baptist pastorate for just over 10 years. And since then, Reverend Gary Baker and Reverend John Armstrong have served the church for 7 and 9 years. Today, Reverend Lindsay Kroll is once again providing interim pastoral leadership. Over 160 years, Bathurst Baptist Church has been a place where people have been able to gather to worship the Lord God and to grow in their relationships to God and to each other. Many have built their faith foundations here and moved on to serve God and their neighbours around Australia and overseas. We meet at 9:30 on Sunday mornings, and there's also Cafe Church at 6 p.m. on first and third Sundays, and activities such as playtime, women's craft group, women's breakfasts, men's coffee at the RSL. We'd love to see you. Thank you.